Disassembling of my Jaguar S-Type is progressing. Today it's the engine's turn. Hello everybody and welcome to day 28 of my S-Type restoration. Let's get this engine onto a stand and start disassembling. By the way, fresh content is coming up on this channel every weekend, so be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. I chose one of the heavy-duty engine stands capable of carrying up to 900 kilograms. Nevertheless, I replaced the original washers that exceeded the mounting brackets just a tiny bit with larger ones and applied felt guides for a tighter fit and smooth rotation without scratching the painted surfaces. The size of these 4 mounting brackets made it impossible to reuse the 40mm bolts that formerly had connected the engine block to the transmission bell housing. After measuring the bolt holes with a depth of 27mm, I went for 100mm bolts that were a perfect fit, together with 2 washers each. Not to overstress the alloy, I chose the 2 upper and the 2 lowest threaded bolt holes for attaching the carrier. The 2 bolts at the very bottom were aligned in the opposite direction, which means their holes are unthreaded on the engine side. Attaching the mountings at these points would be possible as well, but required 1 nut each and eventually bolts of a different length. Since the engine assembly is quite top-heavy with the cylinder heads in place and also to relieve the 2 upper mounting brackets, I then positioned the carrier as far on top as possible. When finally tightening the bolts, I had to consider a torque spec of 48 Nm or 35 pound-feet regarding the bolts attached to the engine block. To be sure not to exceed these numbers even without using a torque wrench, I sticked to one of my smaller ratchets. Now it was up to raising the engine onto my stand. Unfortunately, its legs interfered with those of my hoist, and there seemed to be no way to safely transfer the block to the stand if it's positioned somewhere besides. The solution is to simply disassemble the stand and place it in between the hoist's legs. After I had attached the mounting plate to the stand and lowered the assembly a little down, I re-equipped the stand with its legs. Job done. Now I could start working on the engine itself and try to remove the wiring harness. First step was to detach a plastic pin behind the driver's side engine mount. For no obvious reason, the harness proceeds behind the power steering pump mounting bracket that also had to be removed. Followed by the AC compressor mounting bracket directly underneath. Of course, the harness was still caught behind the oil dipstick tube. After I had failed in the first attempt, I decided to continue with removing the motor mount and its bracket instead. to the oil dipstick tube that is squeezed into the oil pan with a rubber gasket around it. Getting it out requires some kind of a twisting motion while pulling sharply, which can't be achieved with the upper end of the tube held in place by a stud connected to one of the valve cover bolts. Since the tube was already damaged from unlucky attempts with my water pump pliers, I decided to bend the upper bracket, which allowed me to detach the tube from its mounting and move it freely. At the end, it actually popped out of the lower seating, and I could continue with removing the accessories on passenger side. First, I had to detach two plugs from the oil filter housing. The larger plug simply had to be squeezed with my fingers to get it loose, while I had to work a little bit harder and with a screwdriver on the second one. Now it was up to prying out another plastic pin the wiring harness was attached with to the alternator mounting plate, as possible without scratching the alloy. That has been a really annoying task, quite contrary to unscrewing the remaining motor mount. At the rear, the wiring harness was still attached to both valve covers with one pin each. Not to damage the plastic covers, I applied lubricant first, and the pins were removed quite easily. With the harness now fully detached, I finally could remove it from the engine. Back at the front side, I continued with unscrewing the oil cooler together with the oil filter housing. Separating this assembly wasn't necessary to get it detached and would have required a large Allen key that isn't part of my equipment yet. For gaining easy access to the water pump bolts, its pulley had to be removed first, and here one of Jaguar's special tools comes into play. Since it's actually impossible to counterhold the pulley by hand, I had to figure out some kind of a workaround, and once again the water pump pliers saved my day. But even with all the bolts removed, the pulley didn't want to let loose, not after applying lubricant into the holes, and also hammer strokes couldn't get the problem solved. At some point I realized that the heavily corroded area in the middle belongs to the water pump itself, and the parts may be connected there. I tried to scrape away as much rust as possible, applied rust remover, and finally gave the hammer another try. Compared to its pulley, removing the water pump wasn't a big deal, even though I also had to work quite hard with my hammer and a screwdriver on getting it detached from the metal gasket. And here's all I could do about the crankshaft pulley yet. And this is the result of today's work. At least I have been able to detach all the engine accessories. Next step is to remove the crankshaft pulley that's torqued down to 375 Newton meters. And so I need a special tool here to counterhold. That has to be ordered now. If you liked today's video, please give it a thumbs up. See you back next time. Bye.